That chair.
Thank you, Dan, for those overly generous comments. You know, on an important night like this, I always think it's nice if you could start off with a touch of humor, hopefully accompanied by a little bit of wit. But I had a problem. I don't know any such humor. And then I remembered a dinner I was at with Henry Kissinger, my old friend, who was getting an award. And he stood up, walked over to the platform, and quite imperiously, I thought, surveyed the audience. And then at the end of that survey, he said, "Please be seated." That's supposed to be funny. I'll tell Henry about that. You don't know how that will kill him. He will say, you didn't deliver it right. Okay. Now to Dan, I want to thank you not only for your generosity, but for your kindness. I don't know how many of you noticed this. I did. He referred to me as the longest serving trustee of CED. He could have said the oldest trustee, but he was kind enough to let you make that calculation, not him. You know, if you've been a trustee as long as I have, you've had an opportunity to look at some of the good works and leadership. I was there at the time of the Marshall Plan and what you did there. I was there at the time of establishing the IMF. I was there at the time of the World Bank. All of these are examples of major initiatives. And tonight, I would like to take just a few minutes to talk about a threat that I think is transcendent, that threatens the economic future of this country long term, and most certainly that of our children. And not only state what the threat is, but the need once again, and the serious need, for business leadership. Now, I felt so strongly that this threat, which is not our short-term debt, but our long-term debt in this country, is so serious that we ought to set up a foundation to do that. So since I rarely put my money where my mouth is, I decided I would on this occasion and put most of my resources into this foundation, whose main theme is doing something about our long-term debt. Now, I promise you that I will only give you 2 statistics, just enough to illustrate my point. First of all, I call the long-term debt that we confront unsustainable. But let me see if you agree with me. If you look at the official projections of long-term debt, I keep saying long-term, it's 5 times the average level of debt in this country. Unthinkable in my belief. To give you one more statistic, you know in this organization that economists rarely agree, but they agree on this, that we're living in a far more competitive, technological, R&D world than we have been. And we, with our rather disappointing performance in math and science, education, yes, in infrastructure, where we rank 16th, yes, in training of workers. If you look at all those fields, what you find is that the interest costs alone to meet these big debts long term are 3 to 4 times the total amount that we spend on R&D, on worker training, on infrastructure, and so forth and so forth. So clearly, one of the great questions that you will face and our kids will face is, where do we get the resources? Now, we wanted to be sure. When I say we, I was happy enough to include my son, Michael, who I was smart enough to make CEO of the foundation. But we decided that what we ought to do is make significant grants to the 5 leading think tanks, left, right, center, and so forth. And we said to them, tell us what you think about the long-term debt outlook, and tell us what you would do about it. Much to my pleasure, they were unanimous in their view of how serious this problem was. And they each had their plans, reflecting their philosophic differences, to be sure. But there was widespread agreement. Now, the solutions aren't all that complicated. Doing something about them is. We're going to have to increase revenues one way or another. And I would hope that when we're in the course of saying we're going to reform revenues, we look at tax expenditures, which are the subsidies of our tax system. I saw a study the other day, I couldn't believe the number, that indicated that the tax expenditures were about $1.5 trillion a year, or more than all of the corporate and individual taxes. So we're going to have to do something about the tax system. Then we have entitlements. You may not know that entitlements account for 100% of the increased expenditures over the long term. 100%. I don't know how you get our debt under control without reforming entitlements. And then, of course, there's health care. We spend twice as much as the rest of the world on health care without any appreciable difference in outcomes. Therefore, we are setting up, have set up, a major healthcare center that, unlike any others that I know, focuses 100% on what do we do first to identify those places that have good outcomes and lower healthcare costs. And having identified them, what do we do to get them implemented across the country? So I'd now like to close on the following note. It's one thing for the CED and Pete Peterson to outline proposals at dinners and meetings. But clearly, as someone once said, when economics gets important enough, it gets political. I don't know how many of you have had personal experience with the AARP, but you may know that the membership of that organization is 37 million strong. Furthermore, if you remember from the last political election, presidential, it was very interesting that they ran a major advertising effort. And the headline was, if you are inclined to reform Social Security and Medicare, we will see you at the next election. Now that's the kind of comment that gets the attention of political figures. So what I'm saying is that we are dealing here with something that's very unpopular in America, making sacrifices for the longer term good of the economy and our children. Now we are setting up, have set up, something that's a little dream of mine. And that's what I call the AAYP, the American Association of Young People. And nothing would help me grow old gracefully then to see an AAYP of 37 million members, along with their parents. Keep in mind, this is a moral issue I'm talking about. Someone said to me once that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. So I say to you, thank you very much. We've started. We have 50 colleges now across the country. Bill Clinton, bless him, president, has been active at every meeting we've ever had across the country. And we would welcome your support. So please be seated, and thank you.